There was no alarm clock in the Paleolithic. The morning began in silence, or rather, in the absence of fear. If you woke before dawn, it was likely for one of three reasons: the cold had crept too deep into your bones. Something had made a noise outside, or the fire was dying. In a world with no walls and no locks, the fire wasn't just warm, it was life. Its glow kept predators at bay. Its heat kept limbs from stiffening in the night, and its smoke kept insects and spirits, if anyone still believed in them, away. The fire was everything. You didn't fall asleep without knowing someone was tending it. If it went out while you slept, the next person who awoke would have to revive it fast. And reviving a fire in the cold dark with numb fingers and no margin for error meant friction, breath tinder, and patience. A group could forgive a bad joke. They couldn't forgive losing the fire. You never slept alone. Privacy didn't exist yet, not in the modern sense. People lay close body to body, sharing hides, heat, and the uneven rhythm of breathing. Families pressed together with cousins, elders, children, and sometimes people who weren't related at all, just part of the band. The young curled into adults, the old folded into themselves, and everyone hoped no one rolled too far from the group in the night. Most people lay on animal hides spread over dirt or directly on packed earth. A layer of dried grass might soften it, but not much. If you were lucky, your hide had fur on one side and wasn't soaked through. If you were unlucky, the ground felt like it was trying to swallow your hips whole. Some shelters were caves if you lived near them and no one else had already claimed them. Others were crude lean-tos built from branches covered with hides or sod and reinforced against the wind. There was no luxury, no insulation, only survival. The first person to stir each morning rarely did it by choice. It might have been the elder with the chronic cough, or a restless child who whispered too loudly. Sometimes it was the person tasked with fire duty, blinking at the coals and cursing their luck. There were no roosters, no bells, only instinct and necessity. You listened. That's what you did first. Was the fire still breathing? Was anyone crying? Were the wolves howling too close? Were the birds silent, which oddly enough could be worse than hearing them scream? After listening came looking. You watched how others moved. Were they stretching normally? Was someone limping again? Did anyone wake up with their face too pale or their breath too shallow? You didn't have medical training, but you had experience, and experience kept your people alive. Then came the cold. Not the kind you feel in an air-conditioned room. Not even the kind that makes you want to curl up in a blanket. This cold had claws. It slid down your neck and into your ribs. It sat behind your knees and underneath your fingernails. Getting up meant confronting it. So most people did not right away. Instead, they curled tighter, reached out toward the fire, shifted their bodies closer to a warmer body nearby. Even if it was the smelly uncle who snored all night, warmth wasn't about manners. It was about survival. Eventually, someone would groan. A familiar groan, the universal Paleolithic signal for fine, you'll get up first. The first task was always the same: check the fire. If the coals were still glowing, they'd be fed. Bits of dry grass, bark, twigs, sometimes dried dung, if that's what burned best. Smoke curled up slowly, mixing with the breath of the newly awake. If the fire had gone out, then it was time to curse. Quietly, but with commitment. The next task: tools. Even before food people checked their blades, their scrapers, their spear points. Because without tools, you didn't get food. You didn't prepare hides. You didn't defend yourself if something crawled in under the shelter. Stone tools were sharpened with care. A bad edge could slice your hand instead of the meat. A chipped flake could ruin a hunt. Some tools were borrowed especially from the better craftsmen or craftswomen in the group. But borrowed didn't mean free favors carried value. Children were always the first to fully wake. They fidgeted, poked things, argued. Some went looking for old bones or beetles to play with. Some just started asking, "Is there food?" The answer was often, "If you find it." Food wasn't guaranteed. Leftovers from the night before might still hang near the fire. A strip of dried meat, maybe a roasted leg of something small. If it was there and untouched by scavengers, it was a blessing. But usually, breakfast meant improvisation. The Paleolithic didn't come with breakfast menus. It came with roots, bitter leaves, and insects if you could find them. But before any real foraging began, before the decisions of the day were made, there was a brief moment, just a minute, sometimes less, when the group was gathered around the fire again, all barely awake, blinking at the world that was colder, darker, and more dangerous than any of them preferred. In that moment, they didn't speak much. There wasn't much to say. They had woken up. They were still alive. The fire was still burning, and that was enough for now. The fire, once coaxed back to life, sputtered and hissed as damp twigs caught reluctantly. Smoke rose in erratic streams swirling through the shelter, like a lazy ghost before escaping through the thatched roof or cave mouth, or not escaping at all. Eyes watered. People coughed. No one complained. Complaining wasn't efficient. Outside, the wind was sharp and rude. The kind of wind that slipped under hides and stabbed through seams. It bent low shrubs and rattled dry leaves still clinging to their branches. Inside, the group moved slowly. The air still carried the lingering scent of animal fat smoke and sleep. Not pleasant, but familiar. The morning truly began when the children became impossible to ignore. They rolled around on the ground, uncoordinated bundles of elbows and tangled hair. They pestered the firekeeper with sticks. They prodded old bones, poked embers, fought over a dry root someone had chewed half to death the day before. One of them tried licking soot off a rock. No one stopped them. Children were annoying but necessary. They learned by doing, and doing often meant chaos. A sharp voice, perhaps a mother's, perhaps an aunt's, snapped through the haze. Get your feet away from the fire. The child obeyed, dragging their hide-wrapped legs backward with exaggerated drama. Another child began rummaging in the corner for something to chew. The concept of breakfast as we know it didn't exist yet. No one expected a meal at dawn, but everyone hoped. If last night's hunt had gone well, there might be meat left. A scrap of smoked hair, a sliver of marrow bone, dried tendon, hide shavings boiled until soft enough to swallow. These were victories, not meals. More often the fire pit was bare, and the smell of ash didn't fool anyone into thinking it was food. The adults knew what had to be done. Someone muttered about checking the traps. Another reached for their digging stick. The tools leaned against the wall like silent participants. Spears, scrapers, stone blades still stained with use. A few had been repaired in the night. Their sinew bindings tightened, their handles re-wrapped with hide. They weren't beautiful, but they worked, and worked was beautiful in its own way. Someone headed for water. That task was rarely easy. Streams were not always near. Puddles could be dangerous. And if the water source had frozen, breaking through the ice meant freezing your own hands in the process. There were no clay pots. Water was carried in animal bladders, skin bags, or the mind remembering where to find it and praying it hadn't dried up or turned foul overnight. When water arrived, it was shared carefully. Small sips, no waste. A child cried when told no more. An elder grunted and gave them theirs anyway. Hunger made people generous, or desperate, or both. The foragers moved first, mostly women, older children, sometimes elders, who knew the land better than their own faces. They left in small groups, fanning out slowly across familiar territory. They looked for tubers, berries, edible shoots, insects, eggs. Nothing fancy, just calories. They didn't walk casually. Every step was a calculation. Where animals had passed, which tree hadn't borne fruit. Last time, what root looked like food, but wasn't. Experience spoke louder than instinct. A single, misidentified leaf could end in vomiting hallucination, or worse. And the plants weren't the only problem. Birds, squirrels, even bears, they were all competitors. If a forager found a berry bush already half plucked, They scanned the ground for paw prints before blaming the children. Back at the shelter, a low rhythm emerged, the music of maintenance. Someone flaked stone. Another scraped a hide. Someone else squatted near the fire, drying their foot wrappings over a stick while turning a bone in their hand, studying its shape, wondering if it could become a better tool than it used to be. One woman, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, pulled a long strand of sinew through her teeth, tightening the lashing on a spear shaft. Her hands moved with practiced speed, as if remembering every injury this weapon had prevented or failed to. An older man rubbed his knee, then muttered something about damp hides. No one answered. He said it every morning. The children, momentarily quiet, clustered around a half-broken pot made from bark and pitch. They dropped pebbles into it, stirred it with a stick, and declared it a soup. When asked what kind, they responded with a wordless yell and scattered like startled birds. Laughter flickered through the group. Just for a second. By now the light had changed. The sun, slow and uncertain, finally crept over the horizon, painting the land in dull gold and sharp blue. Shadows grew long. Tree branches looked like spears reaching sideways across the earth. And with that light came urgency. The hunters gathered. They didn't announce it. They just began doing the things hunters do, checking bindings, re-wrapping feet, tightening packs. Quiet, focused, no drama. Drama wasted energy. You needed that energy to chase something that could kill you back. Some of them had faces marked with soot, not as decoration, but to reduce glare. Some tied their hair back. Others didn't bother. What mattered was your arm, your aim, your calm. Not everyone left to hunt. That was the balance. For every group that moved outward into the forest or hills, another stayed behind, tending fire, watching children, listening for danger. No one had free time. Even sitting was a form of contribution, keeping the sharp tools from being stepped on, the food from being stolen, the knowledge from being forgotten. Time had no numbers, no clocks, only tasks, cycles, patterns, pressure. And hunger was always part of the pattern. So the day continued, not because anyone willed it to, but because it had to. Because breakfast wasn't a meal, it was a hope. Because warmth wasn't comfort, it was protection. Because the Paleolithic morning wasn't about waking up, it was about surviving the hour that came after. The smell of fresh blood changed everything. If the hunters returned with a kill, it wasn't just food. It was a shift in rhythm. Movement became quicker voices. Rose hands, reached not in greed, but in relief. The group flowed into action with the efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times in hundreds of places for thousands of years. The animal, whatever it had been, was now motionless, sprawled beside the fire. A deer, maybe, or a wild pig, its hooves stiff, its mouth slack. The hunt was over, but the work had just begun. No one wasted time. The butchering began while the carcass was still warm. A skilled pair of hands found the seam beneath the belly fur. Stone blades, sharp but brittle, slid through skin and sinew. A younger helper held the limb steady, learning by doing. The hide was peeled back carefully, not just to access the meat, but to preserve the skin. Nothing would be discarded without thought. Nothing could be. The guts were removed in silence. Intestines, liver, stomach, all laid aside with practiced intent. A child might run off with a bladder to blow it up like a toy. Someone else would separate fat from muscle. Another would break bones to extract the marrow. It wasn't gruesome. It was meticulous, respectful, necessary. The smell, metallic, rich, earthy, filled the shelter, mixing with smoke and old sweat and dried herbs. It was the smell of life continuing. If the animal was large enough, some of it would be cooked immediately. Organs first, they spoiled quickly. Someone threw a handful of coals into a shallow pit, laid the liver across a flat rock, and began fanning the heat. Another person crushed dry herbs with their fingers and sprinkled them across the meat, not for flavor, but for their known effect on digestion. Everything had meaning. Even seasoning was survival. Children circled like birds. They waited for scraps, not the worst bits, just the ones too awkward to divide among adults. A rib too small to share. A chunk of lung no one else wanted. When the first pieces were ready, there was no feast. Just quiet, chewing hands, cupped eyes focused on what was left. The elders were served first. Not always, but often. Not because of custom, but because they knew things where water vanished in dry seasons, which mushrooms killed slowly, which direction to run when the wind changed. Knowledge earned meat, then the adults, then the children. There was no line, but there was order. The chewing was slow. Every bite mattered. No one overate. There was no overeating. A good kill meant a slightly less hungry tomorrow, not a full belly tonight. While some ate, others worked. Meat was sliced into strips and hung above smoke. Fat was packed into hide-wrapped pouches. Bones were stacked, the thickest ones for tools, the smaller ones for boiling. A rib could become a sewing awl, a knuckle a bead, a jawbone a scraper. You didn't just eat the animal, you absorbed it. Even its breath, the last air it exhaled, lingered in the group. When the meal ended, no one announced it. People simply leaned back, exhaled, rubbed ash from their fingers. The children still chewed. The older ones now sat cross-legged, turning bits of sinew into cord or folding bark into pouches. Life didn't pause after eating. It just shifted focus. Conversation returned gently, a soft retelling of the chase, where the animal had bolted, how the wind had turned, who had thrown first, who had bled. These weren't stories for ego. They were data. Every hunt was a lesson. You learned how not to die by listening to how someone almost did. Nearby, one woman lifted her arm to show a scar. Faint silvery stretched across her ribs. She touched it with 2 fingers and said nothing. The others nodded. They'd seen it before. They'd heard the story before. But it mattered. Every scar was a reminder of cost. Not just personal cost, communal. Someone laughed, a short, hoarse sound. It rippled outward. Laughter was allowed, but rarely loud. The world was always listening. Too much noise could attract the wrong ears. But for now, the group let themselves laugh, just a little, just enough. And then someone pointed upward. Clouds, not many, but heavy, dark, moving quickly. Shelters were checked, hides were resecured, tools pulled inside, fire pits covered partially to protect the coals. If rain came, it would not be kind. Water was needed, but too much at once ruined. Dry goods soaked hides turned ash into sludge. Preparedness wasn't panic, it was pattern. One of the elders, eyes pale with age, sniffed the wind, said nothing, just grunted, stood, and tightened the bindings around her ankles. Everyone noticed. No one commented. Another woman collected dry grass, stuffed it under a ledge to keep it from the rain. A man sharpened a blade, not because it was dull, but because it was the one thing he could control. And slowly, the group shifted again, from eaters to caretakers, from scavengers to planners. A few stepped away to check the pit traps in case rain filled them and made them useless. Someone else fetched extra tinder. A child stacked flat stones near the fire, mimicking the way they'd seen it done before. No one called it a storm. No one named the clouds. But everyone knew something was changing in the air. The clouds hung lower now. They pressed against the horizon like wet wool smearing the sky in shades of slate and bruise. Wind slipped through the trees with a colder edge sharp enough to lift the fine hairs along your forearms. A single drop of rain fell, then another and another. No one said, "It's starting." They just moved. Shelters were tightened cords, pulled hides, reinforced baskets shifted inward. Things that weren't meant to get wet were stacked on stones or hung from branches. The dry patch near the fire became a crowding point. Wet feet would mean days of discomfort, blisters rot chill that curled into your bones. It was panic. It was practice. Rain had no schedule, but people had memory, and the children, at first excited, grew quieter as the drizzle settled into steadiness. They leaned into their mothers' pulled hides over their heads, huddled close to smoke that didn't rise anymore but clung low and thick. The fire hissed in protest. Someone added bark. Someone else fanned it with a flattened reed mat. Even in the wet, the fire had to survive. Nearby, a woman shook out a fur and turned it into a canopy weighed down by stones at each corner. Underneath, she worked quickly, stripping sinew into threads, checking for mold along the edges of a gut pouch, rubbing oil into a stiffened boot wrap. She didn't speak. Her face was set like carved bark. This wasn't her first storm. It wouldn't be her last. An elder sang something soft and cracked almost like wind. Not a lullaby, not a chant. Just a line of melody so old it had no words anymore. The child beside her didn't understand it, but leaned against her hip anyway. Further back, where the land dipped toward the forest, two figures trudged uphill. Foragers returning late. Their bundles, damp and wilted, were still cradled carefully in arms and under cloaks. Mushrooms, bark peelings, a nest of ant eggs. Someone raised a hand in greeting but didn't shout. Voices were hard to hear when the rain came between you and everything else. And then, without warning, thunder. Low, distant, but unmistakable. Some flinched. Others didn't react at all. Thunder was only sound after all. It didn't carry claws or teeth. But it did bring a kind of silence, the way a room goes quiet when someone important enters. Everyone felt it. Now came the time for doing nothing. Not laziness, not boredom. Just stillness, the enforced patience of weather. A boy sat cross-legged by the edge of the shelter and pulled bits of dried grass into pieces, one strand at a time. Not because he needed to, because it gave his fingers something to do. A girl beside him began carving lines into a piece of soft wood. Meaningless spirals, maybe. Or maybe the start of something she would repeat every time it rained. Inside, someone pulled a hide over their shoulders and rested against the wall. Another leaned against their side, adjusting silently. Warmth moved through touch. So did comfort. So did fatigue. In the back, a group of women sorted through their toolkits. Stone scrapers, bone needles, bits of shell for decoration. The movement was quiet. They were preparing for work that couldn't begin until the storm passed, but readiness was its own kind of labor. No one looked bored. Boredom wasn't real, yet not in the modern sense. There was always something to be done, or remembered, or avoided. Even waiting had weight. A man older than most, but younger than the elders, reached into a pouch and pulled out a strip of ochre. With a wetted fingertip, he began rubbing it against a flat piece of bark until red dust gathered. He added a little grease, stirred it into a thick paste. He began to paint. Not an image, not at first. Just a line, then a curve, then another. The others didn't watch directly, but they noticed. No one interrupted. Painting wasn't performance. It was thinking with your hands, feeling something take shape outside your body. The rain softened. Not stopped, but softened. The girl near the entrance reached out with her palm and caught a few drops. She squinted at the sky. The clouds still moved, but slower. The forest was quieter. Even the birds, what few remained, had tucked themselves deep into the canopy. A quiet hour passed. One woman began to hum, her voice low and repetitive. A man joined her, softly, tapping a rhythm against his thigh. A third began threading beads through hair-bone, shell-polished seeds. Not decoration for vanity, for meaning, memory, identity. A child watched, fascinated, and offered a feather they had found days ago. It was taken, added. A small nod passed between them. Then, without ceremony, the sun began to fight its way through. A single shaft of light touched the far wall of the shelter. It lit the bark, the ochre, the fire, the face of a child half asleep. People noticed again wordlessly. Eyes lifted, shoulders moved. Breaths were released through the nose. The rain was ending, but the day was not. Tasks returned. The rhythm rebuilt itself, not rushed, just resumed. There was meat to smoke hides, to stretch herbs to dry before mold claimed them. The tools waited, The fire regained its height, and the land washed and gleaming became itself again. No one cheered, but the feeling was close. The air after rain always smelled older, not cleaner, not fresher, just older, as though the earth had opened its mouth for a moment and exhaled something deep. The dirt had changed. It had weight now. The grass bent differently. Footprints held longer. The forest soaked and steaming pressed closer, and every step away from the shelter squelched underfoot. People moved carefully. Slippery ground turned a twisted ankle from nuisance to threat. A broken limb could mean weeks of dependence, something no one truly afforded. But the work resumed. The hides, stretched taut over wooden frames, needed scraping before they stiffened into unusable crust. One woman braced the skin with her knee while pulling a sharp-edged stone across the flesh side, methodically shaving away fat and sinew. Each movement made a wet, fibrous sound unpleasant but necessary. The blade dulled quickly. She switched to another. Not far away, a younger girl pounded fibers in a bark from a tree against a flat stone, softening it until it could be twisted into cord. Her hands moved without rhythm, adjusting instinctively to the resistance. A pile of finished strands grew beside her, and though no one had told her to do it, everyone noticed. In the center of it all, the fire roared again, no longer in defense, but in confidence. Smoke spiraled into the air, fragrant with wet wood animal grease, and the cracked marrow bones now bubbling in a pot made from a folded stomach, lining propped up by stones. A child poked it with a stick, stirring the mix, trying not to spill it. The smell was strong, unfamiliar to modern noses rich with blood and herbs full of iron and something wild. Nearby, two boys squatted in the mud, shaping rough balls of clay around small stones. One of the elders had shown them how to press their thumbs into each sphere, then dry them slowly. No one said why, but the boys knew it mattered. Maybe for slings, maybe just for hands to remember the shape. The hunters hadn't left again yet. They waited, repaired, spoke little. Spears were inspected again. Lashings, retied shafts straightened over flame. One man worked the edge of a flint blade with a tool so small it was hard to see what it did, but when the edge was tested, it sliced hide with no sound at all. Another prepared a pouch with dried fat old meat and crushed roots, something to chew on the trail. He didn't name it. It didn't need a name. It only needed to keep him moving if the hunt went longer than planned. Elders gathered on the drier side of the shelter, bent together like tree trunks, leaning against the same wind. They spoke in fragments, short thoughts, names no longer used, rivers now dry, a cave where someone once died in sleep peacefully, which was rare. One of them held a carved bone, turning it in his fingers, tracing the lines someone else had made long ago. Perhaps he had carved them himself and forgotten. Not far off, a young mother combed lice from her daughter's hair with a notched stick. The girl winced. The mother hummed, not in comfort, in rhythm. The act itself had a beat. Flick, hum, flick, hum. The lice were dropped into the fire. A boy watched with fascination. He'd have his turn soon. The day pushed forward. An older girl, too old to play, not old enough to hunt, began stacking stones in a line near the trees. No one asked why. Maybe a boundary, maybe a pattern, maybe her own quiet way of speaking when words felt useless. Her hands were strong, her shoulders shaped by work. She placed the last stone with precision, then walked away without looking back. Farther out, the edge of the forest shimmered with dampness. You could hear the birds again now, cautious, testing the silence. A squirrel flickered through the branches. Somewhere a hawk screamed too high to see, but near enough to feel in your ribs. The foragers prepared to leave again. Their eyes scanned the sky, the trail, the forest edge. They checked the digging sticks, the baskets, the wrapped feet. There was no speech of encouragement, no ceremony, just readiness. One woman tucked a shard of antler into her belt. Another adjusted her bundle. Then they left, stepping into the wet undergrowth, feet silent, eyes sharp. Back at the shelter, the stew had finished. It wasn't served. It was passed, carefully in shallow scoops. Burned fingers were licked, not cursed. Everyone ate a little. Everyone understood what a little meant. Even the dogs, half wild, lingering at the perimeter, received a bone or two. Not out of affection, but because they remembered who fed them. Because when danger came, they barked first. Evening light began to stretch the shadows again. The storm had passed, but the air hadn't forgotten it. Everything smelled of aftermath, of leaves pressed flat to earth, of burned hair, of survival. Someone scratched a line into the dirt with a stick. No one watched. No one asked what it meant. Maybe it didn't mean anything. Maybe it meant, we were here today. And that was enough. The light changed without permission. It wasn't night yet, but it wasn't day anymore either. That in-between time when shadows stretched long and uncertain and colors turned strange. The world shifted from brightness to suggestion. Shapes blurred, sounds sharpened. Every small rustle, every footstep in the leaves became louder, more meaningful. People felt it in their ribs, that ancient tightening. A sensation older than language. It said, if you're going to finish something, do it now. One man crouched beside the fire, sharpening a tool with rhythmic precision. Not out of urgency, but out of habit. He knew the light would vanish soon, and with it the clarity of edges. Another person tied the last knot on a repaired net. Not for fish, but for trapping birds maybe. Or for hauling roots. Nets were versatile, like most things made with care. The fire cracked as damp wood finally gave in. Sparks rose like insects into the fading sky. Children were quieter now, not because they were tired, but because the world outside had changed tone. The wind no longer moved playfully through the trees. It crept instead low, deliberate. Somewhere in the distance a tree groaned, not breaking, just shifting. The hunters gathered again. This time fewer went. Not because fewer were needed, but because fewer were willing to risk twilight. One man, younger still, unscarred, stood as if to volunteer. An older woman caught his sleeve and tugged once. He sat back down without a word. That was all it took. The group knew the risks of dusk. Hunting in low light wasn't heroic. It was dangerous. The forest stopped cooperating. Prey moved differently. Eyes played tricks. Distance became impossible to judge. Still, one pair stepped out, a man and a woman, both seasoned. They moved silently, almost invisibly, disappearing between tree trunks like smoke. The rest stayed close to the fire. Someone pulled a half-dried hide off its frame and rolled it carefully, tying it with sinew. If rain came again in the night, the hide would be saved. Someone else checked the water skins, feeling the weight, guessing how far tomorrow's walk would be. One had a leak. It would need pitch. A boy found a beetle beneath a rock. He held it between his fingers for a long time before setting it back down. He didn't crush it. He just watched. Nearby, an elder unwrapped a pouch and began to sort through bones, not random ones, marked ones. Each carried a notch, a scratch, a line. Some had burnt edges. Others had small holes. They weren't toys. They weren't charms. There was something else, record ritual memory. No one asked about them. Everyone had their own ideas. The fire became the center again, as it always did when darkness approached. It was not large, but it was confident, steady. Someone fed it deliberately, not all at once, but in pieces, like feeding a person you respected. The wood hissed, then glowed. And then someone began to speak. Not a story, not at first, just a memory. About a river that never dried. About a woman who carried fire on her back for 3 days without letting it die. The details shifted with every retelling, but the essence stayed. She had done something impossible, and so her name was remembered. More joined in. The stories rippled outward like breath. Some were long, some were a single line. A child asked why birds slept in trees. An elder answered, so the ground forgets them at night. No one laughed. The answer was enough. In the background, Someone carved lines into wood. Someone else braided cord. The rhythm of fingers never stopped, even when mouths were busy. Every act was layered work and memory creation and preservation. The two hunters returned just before full dark. No kill, no wounds. They dropped their packs with practiced exhaustion, took water without asking, and sat near the fire. Their eyes didn't say failure. They said, "We returned. That is enough." No one asked for details. Dinner was a piece of dried root and a chew of cold marrow. Enough to push away hunger, not silence it. Enough to sleep. Blankets stitched hides and grass mats were pulled into place. Children curled like animals into the nearest warmth. Adults adjusted. Elders found the driest corners and leaned against the walls. The fire stayed alive, but in turns. One person stayed awake, then another. No watch schedule. Just quiet awareness passed hand to hand like fire itself. Stars came slowly, flickering holes in a sky too wide to imagine. One child whispered, "Is someone watching us from up there?" No one answered, not because the question was wrong, but because it didn't need an answer. Only time. Eventually, even the wind gave up. The trees fell still. The fire dimmed, not from neglect, but understanding. And in the deep dark of the Paleolithic night, the people slept. Together. The night didn't pass quickly. It never did. It stretched long, uneven, full of half-sleep and shifting limbs. Some dreamed. Others only hovered in silence, too alert to sleep deeply, too tired to open their eyes. Dreams came and went like passing shadows. One woman twitched as she slept, her hands clenching as if still scraping hides. A man nearby muttered names no one recognized. A child whimpered softly and turned into her mother's arms, breath evening out again. No one spoke, but the group adjusted around one another, like stones in a stream, always touching, always moving slightly to make space. Outside, the world stayed watchful. Owls called once, then twice. Small animals darted across the wet underbrush, claws whispering against bark and root. A fox crept close to the edge of the shelter, but left without challenge. There was easier prey elsewhere. The fire's glow was a warning. The night keeper stirred the embers with a stick, added dry moss, blew carefully. The coals flared orange, then settled. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. She knew who was still breathing, knew the shape of each silhouette against the fire, knew the rhythm of sleep in this shelter, just as she knew the stars above. By the time her shift ended, unofficial, unsaid, another figure moved beside her, rubbed their face, and took her place. She lay down without words. He took up the stick. There was comfort in the repetition, in the sharing of labor without asking. The knowledge that someone would wake if danger came, that you were never entirely alone, even in silence. Dawn was slow. It crept over the horizon with a pale grey that turned to blue without brilliance. No dramatic sunrise, just light gradually prying its way into the corners of the shelter. Eyes blinked open one by one, limbs unfolded, joints cracked. No one greeted the morning. They just accepted it. The fire was still alive, thin low, but alive. That meant the day could begin. Stretching came first, then checking. Hands, feet, tools, children. One man winced and rolled his shoulder. Another flexed fingers stiff from cold. The woman who had kept the fire rubbed smoke from her eyes and stood, slowly pulling her hide tighter around her back. The children were the last to stir reluctant bundles of tangled hair and sleep-warm bodies. One peeked out from a blanket and groaned. Another curled deeper, pretending not to hear the movement around them. But they couldn't ignore it for long. The world had started moving again, and so would they. No one asked what the plan was. There wasn't one. There were needs, and those needs made plans. A trap line needed checking. The water skins were light. The meat stores were thinning again. The wind smelled like it might turn colder. All of this created motion. Two of the foragers gathered dried bark and slung baskets over their backs. One carried a digging stick, the other a sling. They didn't speak. just nodded to someone near the fire and walked off into the trees. A hunter sharpened his spear without sitting down. His fingers wrapped tight around the shaft, testing the balance. Another adjusted her footwear, leather softened with fat tied with sinew. The soles were patchy. She'd have to remake them soon, but not today. A child returned from relieving himself near the edge of camp, holding a stick with something sticky on the end. Everyone ignored it until he dropped it into the fire. The smell made 2 people gag. A third laughed under his breath. Breakfast was hopeful at best. A handful of berries mostly bruised. A piece of old root, shaved thin and chewed slowly. A single strip of dried meat passed between 3 people. Someone gnawed a piece of leather softened with spit. It tasted like smoke and ash. It was something. No one complained. Hunger wasn't a condition. It was a setting always there, sometimes louder, sometimes quieter. By mid-morning, the group had split again. 2 left toward the river bend, hoping for fish or frogs. A small party went uphill to check snares set days earlier. A young girl and her older cousin carried a bundle of dull stones down to the flaking site to chip new blades. Everyone had work, and for a while the shelter was quieter. Those who stayed behind worked slowly. A man strung a new bow, his feet holding one end while his arms pulled a gut cord into place. A woman softened pine pitch in a shell, stirring it with a twig, readying it for repairs. An elder sorted bone fragments, discarding the split ones, saving the ones still strong enough to become tools or stories. One child drew in the dirt with a charred stick. Spirals, arrows, a shape that looked like a bird or a hand. The firelight made the marks shimmer. Then she rubbed them out with her palm and started again. Time passed not with numbers but with repetition, with tasks done and redone, with quiet gestures, with hunger returning slowly like an old visitor. Then a cry, short, sharp, not alarm joy. The snare group had returned carrying a rabbit, not large but enough. Fur still intact, eyes still wide. One boy dragged it by the hind legs like a prize. Another carried a bundle of greens, bitter stalks but edible. Someone clapped once, not celebration. A signal. The fire was stoked. The rabbit was skinned, gutted. The meat placed on a flat stone over embers. The greens were thrown into a pot with water allowed to simmer. The smell was simple but real. This was a good morning. The group gathered loosely near the fire, warming fingers blinking against the smoke. Someone scratched an itch. Someone else closed their eyes for a moment, face tilted toward the sky. And in the quiet that followed before the food was ready, no one said anything important, because everything important was already known. The rabbit fed fewer than it looked like it would. Once cooked, it shrank muscle tight. Fat already burned off during the animal's own last panic. Still, it was divided. A strip for the elders, a bite each for the children. The liver passed to a pregnant woman. The kidneys shared between 2 hunters. Bones saved stripped clean, thrown back onto the fire for cracking later. Nothing wasted. Never. After eating, the group stretched, shifted, repositioned around the fire, not because they needed warmth, though they did, but because movement was necessary. You sat too long, your muscles remembered and not kindly. Hips stiffened, ankles ached, wrists buzzed with the familiar numbness of work. A man stood and walked in a wide arc around the shelter, not for purpose, but to feel his legs again. A woman followed, arms swinging, loosening her shoulders. A child ran simply because no one stopped him. Nearby, the hide rack was reset. Yesterday's, skins now drier, easier to shape. A group of women knelt near it, pulling the edges taut again, stretching fiber over wood. They worked in rhythm sometimes, singing softly, not for music to keep pace. They spoke about nothing and everything, how the last scrape tore too deep, how the weather was warming, and that meant bugs soon. Whether the woman near the far wall was finally pregnant again. She hadn't bled in 3 moons. Someone asked what to do if a deer is found tangled in one of the old traps. One answer came quick, slit its throat before it hurts itself more. Another said, wait, it might already be dead. Questions and answers passed like smoke, drifting ungraspable but present. A young boy watched the women work, squatting nearby silent. His fingers moved in time with theirs, though he held nothing. One of the women noticed. She tossed him a dull blade. He caught it without flinching. Began copying the motions. Learning was not a lesson. It was absorption. Down the slope, 2 foragers returned, wet to the knees. One held a gourd half filled with something, probably eggs, maybe frogs. The other carried nothing but her walking stick and a weary look. But they walked upright. No limp, no blood. That was success. They reported quietly. River's edge was rising. Mushrooms near the rotted stump were too wet to eat. Found honey high in a tree. Couldn't reach it. Tomorrow maybe. One of the elders nodded, tugging on a scrap of fur beside him. That meant remember. The hunters prepared to leave again. This time there were 3. 2 men and a woman, all older, all marked. Scars on fingers, across ribs, one missing half an ear. They didn't talk much. Their justice straps picked through the tools took no more than what they needed. A throwing stick, a spare blade, a pouch of dried meat and water. Before leaving, one knelt beside a sleeping child and gently pulled a hide over her feet. Then they vanished into the trees, as if pulled by threads only they could see. Back at the shelter, the sun reached its highest point. No one measured it, but the shadows shortened and the heat shifted. It meant rest in theory, but no one stopped working. They just changed pace. A girl picked burrs from her brother's hair. Another rolled old bark into kindling bundles. A woman sat down and began mending a pouch, sewing carefully with bone and sinew, every stitch placed with practiced grace. She didn't look up, even when a small bird landed nearby. She only smiled faintly, then kept sewing. Someone near the fire began to hum. It wasn't a melody anyone could name. It was more like breath turned musical by habit. Another person joined whistling between their teeth. A third tapped a stick against a pot rhythmically. No dance, no audience. Just the quiet sound of people remembering they were still alive. And then laughter. Unusual midday. One of the older boys had slipped while walking across a log and ended up flat on his back in the mud. He didn't cry. He lay there for a moment, arms splayed as if considering the universe. Then he grinned. Mud covered his chest face, even his teeth. Someone tossed him a hide scrap. Another threw a twig at him. The laughter faded quickly, but the warmth stayed. The boy cleaned himself by rolling in the grass, and finally returning to the fire steaming faintly. He looked proud. He was. Not long after, one of the foragers came back with a leaf-wrapped bundle. Inside insects, large ones. Beetles, soft-bodied and slow, rich in fat. She unwrapped them slowly and passed them to the children first. They wrinkled their noses. Ate anyway. An elder took one, popped it into her mouth and nodded. No words, just approval. The day continued. A net was hung to dry. Cord was twisted into a loop. Ash was collected from under the fire. A rock was chipped, then chipped again, until it became something sharp enough to matter. And in the distance, something moved. Not close, not threatening, but enough to cause stillness. Heads turned, ears strained. Nothing followed. Someone clicked their tongue once, a short, sharp command. Stay alert. But the sound didn't return. The trees rustled with their own rhythm. The world sighed again, and the people exhaled. The alert faded, but not entirely. That's how it worked. Even when the sound past the tension didn't vanish. It thinned, but it stayed in the spine, the shoulders, the corners of the eyes. People didn't talk about it. They just moved a little slower, listened a little longer, readied themselves just in case. Someone moved the children closer to the fire. Not urgently, just with a hand on a shoulder, a quiet nod. One girl held her little brother's hand and didn't let go even when he tugged. The elders leaned in towards each other without speaking. Their ears older than anyone's kept listening. Then nothing. A bird called. A branch fell. Wind moved through the trees like a hand brushing against fur. So slowly, the rhythm returned. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened again. Not heavy, but enough to make the light flatter colder. It pulled shadows across the ground at strange angles, made every shape seem unfamiliar. A woman squatted near the hearth, grinding something in a shallow stone, seeds maybe, or dried leaves. She moved in circles, pressing with her knuckles, whispering softly to herself. Not a prayer, just the rhythm of grinding turned into breath. When she finished, she scraped the powder into a pouch and tied it with gut string. She looked up, eyes scanning the group, then tucked it under her belt. Someone would need it later. A young man returned from the riverbank with damp clothes and scratched hands. He carried a single fish, long, narrow, silvery blue. He dropped it beside the fire and sat without explanation. No one praised him. No one mocked the size. It was food. It would be eaten. The fish was cleaned in silence, its head twisted off. Guts pulled out, fed to the flames. Its flesh sizzled on a flat stone, thin enough to cook fast, oily enough to leave a shine on fingers. The first bite went to a child too small to walk. The last bite went to the man who caught it. That was the way of things. Elsewhere, a woman braided cord into a longer strand, not for sewing, for carrying. When finished, it would hold a basket against a back or a child against a hip. She hummed slightly as she worked, her lips barely moving. The melody was old, maybe older than speech. One of the elders spoke then, low, without announcement. A story halfway between memory and invention. About a time when the rivers were wide enough that people crossed them on floating logs, and a bear waited on the other side, and the man who faced it didn't fight. He sang, and the bear, confused or maybe curious, simply left. No one interrupted. No one asked questions. The children stared, eyes wide. Even the youngest knew that stories weren't explanations. They were scaffolding. They gave shape to the things people feared, wanted, or couldn't understand. Stories didn't explain the world, they held it in place. Later, someone began carving a design into a long bone. Not decorative, not quite. The pattern was repetitive lines, dot curves. It could have been a record. It could have meant nothing, or everything. Someone else began stacking small stones in a circle, spacing them evenly, adjusting and readjusting. A child knocked them over. The man just smiled, picked them up, and began again. The 3 hunters had not returned. People noticed, but no one said it aloud. The sun was low now. They had left before midday. If they were tracking something, they might return at dusk. Or not. A woman near the edge of the camp knelt and rubbed her hands with crushed mint. The scent rose briefly, sharp and clean. She touched her face, her arms, a gesture of focus, or patience, or memory. Dinner was thin. Some root mash, bitter and fibrous. A handful of dried meat soaked in water until soft enough to chew. A cracked bone heated over flame until it split with a sound like a bird's cry. The marrow was scraped out and shared. A few children pouted. They had tasted better, smelled better, seen more meat on luckier days. But they ate anyway. They didn't yet understand hunger, the way the adults did, as a shape that lived with you, not just an absence of food. After the meal, people drifted. Some cleaned tools. Others sat in thought. A boy traced spirals in the dirt with a stick again and again, until his mother brushed it away with her foot. Someone coughed deep, ragged. Not new. It had been there for days. The group noted it, the way they always did. Quietly, with eyes, with silence. A girl ran chasing nothing. Her feet slapped the damp ground fast and wild. No one stopped her. She ran until she couldn't. Then she dropped into the grass, panting, laughing. A man nearby smiled. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Still, the hunters had not returned. When the shadows finally overtook the camp and the sky began to deepen into grey-blue dusk, someone moved closer to the trees. They didn't call out. That would be foolish. They just stood, listening, waiting, because when someone didn't come back, it wasn't panic. It was calculation. First, how many hours had passed? Second, what were they carrying? Third, what tracks would they leave if injured? Fourth, how many others could be spared to search? But none of those questions were asked out loud. Not yet. Dusk deepened into something thicker than night. It was the kind of darkness that pressed down instead of simply arriving, a slow tightening of the world like a blanket pulled over the eyes. The trees no longer looked like trees. They became outlines. The shelter faded into shadow. The fire, once central, now flickered like a warning rather than a comfort. Still, the hunters did not return. One by one, people noticed, but still no one spoke it aloud. A man stood near the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, watching the path between the trees. His eyes didn't blink often. Behind him, a woman knelt near a basket, pretending to check its contents. Her hands moved, but her eyes were fixed on the same path. The others went about their tasks, but slower. Movement softened. Words dropped away. The fire snapped louder than before. The small sounds of life cracking bones, drying skins, whispered questions from children faded into the background hum of waiting. A woman lit a second fire. Smaller, off to the side. Not for warmth, it wouldn't throw enough heat, but for light, for boundary, for welcome. If the hunters came back, that flame would show them the way. It was a gesture older than language. We are here. We are still here. Come home. Someone added green branches to it. The smoke rose in columns thick and scented. If the hunters were near, they'd smell it. If something else was near, they might stay away. A boy asked quietly, "What if they're not coming back?" The elder beside him didn't answer. Instead, she reached out and took a stone from the fire's edge flat, warm, smooth from use, and placed it in the child's hand. He held it confused, then nodded slowly, as if the answer had come from the heat itself. It wasn't reassurance. It was continuity. Near the main fire, someone began to prepare again. Not for celebration, not for grief, just for the next thing. A pot was checked, a hide rearranged. A blade was honed slowly, methodically. These weren't distractions. They were anchors. Action was memory habit tether. You did what your body remembered, because thought was a dangerous place to linger. Eventually, someone stood and stepped beyond the firelight. Not far, 10 paces, maybe less. He crouched near the trail, pressed his palm into the mud, then stood and looked at the trees. His posture said, "Everything should I go." Another came beside him, just long enough to lay a hand on his shoulder. He stayed. They both stared into the dark until their shapes disappeared. Behind them, the group began to shift. No one would sleep fully. Not tonight. Children were bundled tighter, placed between adults covered with extra hides. 2 elders took the outside edges of the shelter backs to the wall eyes on the open forest. Someone piled dry kindling near the fire. Someone else placed a bundle of slings within reach. It wasn't fear, it was readiness. The moon finally lifted, pale blurred behind low cloud. Enough to see by, not enough to trust. The trees swayed slightly, unsure whether to be still or loud. Then finally a sound. Soft, broken. Not footsteps, not speech. A snap of a twig. A dragging breath. People rose, not all at once, not dramatically. Just a shared rippling motion. Eyes turned toward the noise. From the trees came 2 figures, one upright, one leaning heavily. They entered the firelight slowly, faces dirt-streaked. One man, one woman. Her leg dragged wrapped with something dark, a makeshift splint bound in hide. The man's face was grim but intact. He guided her step by step. There was no announcement, no shout of relief, no applause. People moved forward steady. One woman took the injured one's other arm. Another cleared space near the fire. A child reached for a water skin and held it out. The injured woman drank without looking at who offered it. She stared at the flames, like they were the only solid thing left. Someone fetched crushed leaves from a pouch. Another unwrapped a stone blade. A small bowl was placed beside the wound. The elder leaned forward, eyes sharp. She didn't touch it. She looked, then looked at the man. He shook his head. Not bitten, not broken, just cut, deep. That was better. Not good, but better. They worked quickly. The gash was cleaned. Boiled water, chewed herbs, ash rubbed around the edges. It stung. The woman bit down on a piece of wood, but made no sound. The firelight flickered across her jaw, clenched tight. Her hands gripped the earth. When it was over, she said one word. No one repeated it. She would live. No one asked a third. The man looked down. That was all. The circle around the fire deepened. Not in grief, not yet. That came later. This was acknowledgement. A space opened. A silence made. The kind of silence that said, we will remember. But not now. Now there was a wound to watch. A fire to tend. A child who had not yet eaten. The shelter shifted again. The injured woman laid down her leg propped on bark and hide. Two people lay beside her, warmth, contact, vigilance. A man took the outer edge spear nearby. Another adjusted the hide roof to shield from wind. The fire was fed, not high but steady. The moon climbed higher, pale and distant. And this time, when the world darkened fully, when the last embers hissed under ash, and the night resumed its full weight, no one waited any more. They just kept watch. The fire settled into a soft glow, its edges dulling under ash. The injured woman didn't sleep, but her eyes closed. Her breathing slowed, no longer tight with pain. Her leg cleaned and wrapped, no longer bled. It throbbed, of course, but that was a different kind of fear, the kind people survived. The man who returned with her sat a little apart, his legs drawn to his chest, elbows on his knees. He hadn't spoken since. Not from shock, not from shame, just from stillness. A pause between what had happened and what he would carry from it. No one interrupted. The rest of the group moved around him like wind around a stone. Soft, careful, letting him be a shape inside the quiet. A child woke from a nightmare. Not a scream, just a small gasp, enough to make the mother stir arms, finding the child, pulling them close. A whisper, a breath. The fear passed. The man didn't move, but his eyes opened. He watched the child, watched the comfort, watched the fire hold its shape and the sky shift from black to blue again. That slow silvery blue that meant the world was still here, still turning. By morning he stood. No drama, no speech, just a shift of weight. He walked to the stream, knelt and washed the dried blood from his hands, his arms, his face. The water was cold and he stayed in it too long. When he returned, someone handed him a strip of dried root. He chewed it slowly, still standing. No one asked what happened to the third. They would know soon enough. In the way he sat, the way he stared at the trees, the way he handled his tools. That story would come without telling. Near the edge of camp, the injured woman drank water mixed with crushed leaves. Bitterness coated her tongue, but she swallowed all of it. Her face was still, pale lips cracked, but she nodded when someone asked, not in words, just with her eyes. She would keep living. The hunters would not go out again that day. It was known, not spoken. The group adjusted around that reality like a hand curling around stone. There were other tasks, always. The older boys collected stones for napping, not just any stones, but the ones with that strange glassy gleam that promised edges when split right. They carried them in slings over their shoulders, dropping them in a heap near the flaking site. An elder tested one, struck it with a hard antler tine. It shattered beautifully. The women soaked bark again, pounding it with stones until fibers peeled apart. Cords were twisted, some for nets, some for binding. Every movement was careful, patient, not mechanical, repetitive, but never thoughtless. By mid-morning, the fire was back to life, its smoke trailing skyward in long ribbons. Meat was heated, not fresh, but preserved enough to chew, enough to swallow. Children ate first, then the rest, then the dogs who lingered just close enough to be remembered but not chased. The woman with the wound ate too, slowly. She needed help sitting up, but she chewed on her own. When she finished, she leaned her head back and closed her eyes. No one spoke to her. Her silence was work. Healing was its own kind of labor. Later, 2 foragers returned from the western ridge. They carried long grass bundles swollen with insects and shoots. One had a toad in a woven pouch. The other brought bark torn from the heart of a fallen tree. Not sweet, but edible enough. They'd seen nothing dangerous, but they had seen something strange. Tracks, not deer, not boar, not bear. Bare feet, old ones, older than a day, maybe 2. Someone said, "Too small for one of us." Someone else replied, "Too far to be a child." The words hung there, not threatening, not comforting. People had seen such tracks before. Sometimes they led to nothing. Sometimes they meant others, another group, another shelter, other eyes watching from the trees. Not enemies, not friends, just others. The elder, who had seen many winters, just nodded. The foragers described where they'd found them. Not near water, not near shelter, just across a clearing, moving in no clear direction. Wandering, but deliberate. No one panicked, but the fire was fed again. That night, the group gathered closer. The elder spoke again. Not a warning, not a tale, a memory. About a night when 2 groups found each other by accident. One fire, 2 circles. Silent at first, then cautious. Then food shared. Then songs, different rhythms, same pitch. Then silence again. Then walking away. Not friends, not foes. Just 2 shadows in the same wind. The children listened. One asked, "Were they like us?" The elder answered, "They had hands. Fire, faces. That was enough." Near the trees, the man who had returned from the hunt lifted his spear and began retying the sinew near the point. His fingers moved steadily with purpose. He didn't look up, but everyone knew what that meant. He would go again soon. The woman with the wound opened her eyes, looked at the sky, whispered something no one heard, but someone nodded as if they had. The next day began without surprise. There was no storm, no predator at the edge of the trees, no strange sound in the night, only mist low to the ground, curling through grass and stone like breath held too long. It made every footstep vanish, turn shapes into ghosts. But it lifted slowly, as the sun pushed upward piece by piece, and the world returned. The woman with the wounded leg slept longer this time. Her breath had steadied. Her skin was warmer. The swelling remained, but it hadn't spread. That was good. Her wound was cleaned again, and the wrappings changed. When she woke, she asked for water, then food, then silence. No one needed more proof. She would live. The man who had brought her back watched from a distance. He still hadn't spoken much, but now he worked. He scraped a fresh branch, sharpening one end. Not a spear too short. A digging stick maybe, or something else entirely. His face remained unreadable, but his hands were clear he was returning to the world. The others noticed. They didn't comment. They made space. By mid-morning, the camp was busy in quiet ways. Children followed elders to collect dry grass for bedding. A woman dug through a pouch of roots, sorting the sprouting ones from those still good. Another polished bone tools with river stone until the surface gleamed ready to be reused or bartered, if ever there were anyone to barter with again. The boy who had once drawn spirals in the dirt now worked on something more serious, a sling. His knots were sloppy, but the shape was coming together. He swung it once, nearly hit a dog, and laughed until an older girl smacked the back of his head. He didn't try again, but he didn't stop smiling either. In the forest, the foragers moved quieter than usual. The tracks found yesterday, the human ones still sat in their minds. When they bent to collect tubers or peel bark, their ears stayed open. Their eyes scanned shadows before they picked their hands full. They didn't wander far from each other. One woman found a feather wedged in a tree crack, black, long-edged in white. She took it and tied it in, sat on her hair. At the stream, a man caught 2 fish in a hand net, the kind with stones along the edge and a wooden ring at the center. They weren't large, but one was heavy with eggs. He pressed his thumb to its belly, felt the swell. He kept it anyway. Food was food, Back at the shelter, smoke drifted east. It carried with it the smell of boiled roots, cracked bones and damp ash, the smell of survival. One child sneezed, another fell asleep curled around a fur bundle. No one moved him. His dreaming face looked older than his waking one. When the fish arrived, the elders got the first bites. It had always been that way. Not because they demanded it, but because they remembered what happened when people didn't care for memory. The man who caught the fish didn't eat until the very end. When he did, he only took the eye. No one questioned it. By early afternoon, the mist had returned, not thick, but present. The trees blurred at the edges again. The shelter grew quieter. Voices lowered. The elder, who never spoke in the morning, stood. She rarely moved unless she had something to say. Today she picked up a pouch from the fire's edge, small leather tied with red sinew. She shook it once. The sound was dry. Seeds or stones. Then she walked toward the injured woman. She sat beside her uninvited and opened the pouch. From it, she poured a tiny pile of carved tokens, each different. One looked like a bird, another a curled animal. A third was just a spiral. She didn't explain. She simply laid them out between them, then nodded. The injured woman stared at them for a long time. Then she picked one the spiral and handed it back. The elder smiled. That was enough. Later a storm was heard far off, not seen, not smelled, but heard a low rumble like a distant drum roll in the earth. It came and went, more vibration than noise. The children asked if it would reach them. The adults didn't answer directly. They listened again. They waited. When the ground stayed still and the wind didn't change, they returned to their tasks. The storm, for now, belonged to someone else. At dusk, the man who had returned from the hunt, the one who had stayed quiet for days, finally stood near the fire and looked outward. He held no spear, no blade, just a bundle of dried grass in one hand. Then he walked to the edge of the trees and set it down. No one followed. No one asked. He stepped back, and then he waited. Not for something, not for someone, just waited. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over bark and stone and faces worn by days of repetition, it became clear the group wasn't just recovering from the wound, or from hunger, or even from death. They were waiting for whatever came next, because there was always a next. Even when no one knew its name, the bundle of grass sat at the forest's edge all night. It didn't move. No one touched it. The wind shifted once or twice, curling around it like breath withheld, but the bundle stayed upright, dry, pale, deliberate. A marker, or an offering, or a boundary. It meant something, even if no one spoke its meaning aloud. By morning it was gone, not knocked over, not scattered. Gone. There were no tracks, no broken branches, just the shape of absence outlined faintly in dew-damp soil. A few blades of grass still pressed flat where the weight had been. Someone had taken it, or something. The first to see it was the boy who had been pretending to track since he could walk. He crouched low, sniffed the ground as if it would give him a story, then stood and stared into the trees. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just looked back at the fire and nodded once. People noticed. They didn't panic. But the tension returned, not fear, not yet. Just readiness. The kind that lives in the space between what you understand and what you feel. The elders spoke in murmurs, short sentences, a word at a time. Not us, not one of ours. Too clean, too quiet. The man who had placed the bundle didn't speak, but he walked the edge of the clearing twice, checking paths, scanning tree lines. His shoulders had shifted, no longer heavy, no longer hunched, just awake. The woman with the healing leg watched him. She no longer needed help to sit up. She could shift herself slowly, leaning on one arm. Her wound was closing, scabbing. She hadn't smiled yet, but her eyes tracked movement again. That was enough. No one followed the missing bundle. No trail meant no chase. That was the rule. If something wanted to be found, it would leave signs. If it didn't, it was best not to force it, even among humans. especially among humans. Instead, the day began like any other, as it always had, as it had to. Water fetched, bark stripped, cord tightened, fire fed. All things done not because they were safe, but because they were necessary. A girl wove grass mats and told a story while she worked. Not a story passed down, but one she made up as she spoke, adding animals and people and spirits from the corners of her mind. The children nearby listened wide-eyed, laughing at the strange turns. A bird that stole fire, a fish that traded its bones for wings, a grandmother made of stone. No one corrected her. No one reminded her which stories were true. All stories were real in the way breathing is real, in the way silence is. Later, a group went to dig roots near the southern rise, a familiar patch, one that usually yielded just enough. They took digging sticks, baskets, and 2 dogs who followed without command. What they found was not what they expected. The ground had already been turned, not fully dug, but disturbed, scratched, lifted, not by animal, not by weather. Someone had started to dig, then stopped. They said nothing. But when they returned, they walked differently, not hurried, watchful. The way deer walk after seeing motion in the trees, ears back, every step loaded with thought. They didn't lie, they told the truth, but they didn't share it loudly, only with the fire, only in glances. That night, the fire was not bigger but brighter. More hands gathered around it, not from fear but instinct, not because of the dark, but because of what might still be inside it. The elder, who rarely spoke anymore, her teeth worn smooth, her back curved, reached into the firelight and laid down a piece of wood, charred at one end, smooth on the other, carved long ago with a spiral across and a series of notches. She placed it with care, then covered it with a hide, not to hide it, but to keep it warm. Someone asked her why. She said, because it remembers things we forgot. No one questioned her. The boy who always drew in the dirt began again this time. Not spirals, not arrows, but feet, many feet, small ones, large ones, some with claws, some human, some something else. When he was done, he rubbed it all away. It wasn't for anyone else. It was just something that needed to leave his fingers. The moon that night was high and full, casting pale silver across bark and shoulders and the glint of stone blades. The fire burned without smoke, dry wood chosen well. No voices carried, no songs rose, just breath and blinking and the sound of grass shifting under bare feet. The man who had placed the bundle didn't sleep. He sat near the ashes, rubbing a smooth stone in one palm, over and over, until the shape of it disappeared into his hand. Near midnight, one of the dogs lifted its head, ears up, silent. The man didn't move. The dog lowered its head again, but the man saw. And in the distance, just beyond the edge of firelight, someone else was watching too. The figure at the edge of the firelight did not step forward. It hovered, unmoving, blurred where the tree shadows began, more suggestion than shape. The man near the fire didn't rise. He didn't call out. He just turned his head slightly the way one does when listening becomes more important than speaking. The fire crackled. A coal popped. The figure disappeared. Not fled, just gone, like fog pulled back by wind. The man said nothing. The dog, still awake, shifted its weight tail flat against the dirt. But it didn't growl. It only stared where the shape had been. By morning, no signs remained. No footprints, no broken twigs, no scent that drifted beyond the firing. But the story of it not told, only sense lingered in the way people moved. Children stayed closer to their mothers. The older boys carried sticks, not as toys but like weapons. The women didn't sing, and when the injured woman asked for water, she looked toward the tree line before she looked to the cup. That day was slow. It moved the way heavy animals move, with weight, with friction through mud. Tasks were done. Of course they were. Firewood doesn't collect itself. Tools don't sharpen without hands. Hides don't soften without labor. But the rhythm was off. No one strayed far. The The foraging groups halved in size, doubled in caution. The snare lines were checked earlier than usual. The fishing stones were flipped, then reset. No one mentioned the bundle again. No one mentioned the visitor. But the silence around both things thickened. By noon, the sky grew strange. Not cloudy, but thin, stretched. Pale blue washed in white like water poured over ash. The sun showed itself without warmth. Shadows stayed close to the body. A boy brought back a crow's feather, long and black and ragged. He found it stuck in a tree not far from the shelter. When he held it out, the elder woman, the one with the smooth teeth and the pouch of carved tokens, took it in both hands and nodded. Then she placed it in the fire. It curled, cracked, vanished. Not ritual, not fear, just disposal. By afternoon, something shifted again. A sound distant, then nearer. Footsteps. Numb, rustling, like something large pushing through underbrush. Not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate. The man who had stayed up the night before was already on his feet. So were two others, spears in hand, eyes narrow, but nothing emerged. When they moved to check, they found only disturbed leaves. A line through grass, a broken mushroom. Nothing large, nothing certain, nothing useful. But it was enough to change the way the group breathed. Later, a girl tried to laugh at something. A game of tumble, a flatulent dog, and it didn't land. The sound fell flat against the ground and faded like mist. No one stopped her, but no one joined. When evening came, the group built two fires. Not large, not close together. One at the usual center and one 30 paces to the north near the old trail, near where the figure had stood. This one wasn't for warmth. It was for declaration. We see you. The dogs circled both fires. They didn't bark. They didn't whine. But they didn't rest either. One of the children asked if they should move camp. An elder answered, "The ground doesn't change just because your back gets sore." That was as close to no as he would say. Besides, they had shelter here. Water, fish, roots, the bones of what they needed. They weren't cornered. Not yet. But they were being watched. And that meant a decision would come soon. When darkness came, the people didn't gather close. They spread out, each one taking a place just slightly further from the center than normal. It wasn't fear, it was formation. One man sat with his back to the trees, knife across his lap. A woman lay on her side, eyes open, a club beside her hand. The injured woman slept. Her fever was low. Her wound had stopped leaking. And though no one said it, they all knew something would happen soon. The kind of something that doesn't have a name. The moon climbed slowly, pale and dull. And in the moment just before sleep could claim them, that quiet, when even the fire settles into its own breath, a sound came. Not human, not animal, a whistle. 3 notes, not a call, not a cry, just a presence. Soft, faint, but close. No one moved. Even the dog stayed still. It happened once more, then never again. The rest of the night passed without sound. The morning was colder than it should have been. Not winter cold, not breath steaming, but tight. The kind of cold that wraps itself around fingers and waits. Mist moved between the trees like it had business there, sliding low across roots and stones. The second fire was ash, now a wet smear on the earth. The main fire still held coals, but just barely. The group woke stiff. The night had been quiet after the whistle, too quiet, as if the forest were holding its breath. Even the insects had hushed, but nothing followed. No visitor, no storm, no voice from the dark, just the slow, grinding return of silence. And then dawn. No one spoke of it. Instead, they moved slowly, deliberately. They stoked the fire. They drank water. A few chewed on smoked bark to chase off the hunger until something real could be found. The dogs stretched tails, low ears half raised. They didn't bark. They didn't relax. The elder, with the carved tokens, sat cross-legged, her pouch open, but untouched. She didn't cast today. She only watched. One of the women examined the tracks near the tree line. Nothing clear. The grass was pressed flat in a new pattern, but that could have been a deer or something else. The soil gave away nothing. Children were kept close. The usual rhythm fetch water check traps look for roots was interrupted. Only 3 people left the immediate shelter that morning. They carried spears and caution. No one scolded the others for staying back. No one wanted to name the feeling that sat on every shoulder like an invisible bird. Still, work had to continue. The man who had once placed the bundle, the quiet one, sharpened 2 new tips that morning, long ones carved from dark horn. He worked without pause. His hands didn't tremble. He laid them down side by side and picked up another. The woman with the healing leg stirred. She sat upright, teeth gritted against the pull of her healing wound. When someone moved to help her, she waved them off. She wanted to try. It took time, but she stood. The group watched from the corners of their eyes. She balanced the one hand on the wall of the shelter, the other across her ribs. She didn't walk, just stood. And she sat again, not with defeat, but with decision. She would walk soon. In the distance, the party, who had gone to check the traps, returned, empty-handed. They hadn't gone far, not beyond the second ridge. The snares had been tripped, but nothing caught. One trap had been moved. The knot retied wrong. Not poorly, just differently. As if someone else had tried to copy it and hadn't known how. They didn't speak of it loudly. Just handed the cords to the elder, who touched the new knot once and said nothing. By midday, someone had returned to the flint pile. Not the boy, not the usual nappers. An older woman. Her hands were scarred, her eyesight not what it was. But her memory was perfect. She chose a stone. She struck. It split clean. Another. Another. She worked steadily, each motion a continuation of the last, until she had 6 shards laid in a neat row. When asked what they were for, she only said, "In case." In the afternoon, sky cleared, unexpectedly. Sunlight came through the trees like forgiveness, warm and soft. For a moment, the camp breathed again. Children laughed when the dogs chased each other. Someone cracked a joke about deer tripping over their own hooves. Someone else mimicked the elder's snore. A handful of chuckles, nothing wild, just enough to remind the body what it was like to release tension. But under it, the readiness stayed. The man who had stayed awake that night walked the perimeter again. This time, he left markers: a broken branch here, a circle of stones, there a strip of hide tied high in a tree fork. It was not decoration. It was map, pattern, memory for later. At dusk, the second fire was rebuilt. No argument, it was just done. And again, 2 sat near it, not guarding, not speaking, just present. The injured woman moved closer to the fire this time, still seated but upright, awake. One hand rested on a carved stick now, not for walking yet, for claiming, for being ready. That evening, the story told by the fire was old, older than anyone living could remember. About the time when people were not alone, when others walked in the trees, not enemies, not allies, just reflections, people who moved the same, but thought in different shapes. They didn't share food, didn't speak the same, but sometimes they watched each other, and sometimes that was enough. The children listened without fidgeting. Even they knew that this was not just a story. One of the girls whispered, "What did they want?" The elder didn't answer directly. She said, "What do we want when we look at them?" No one spoke after that. That night, the group slept as they had before, scattered, but close enough to hear each other breathe. The second fire burned low. The wind moved gently through the clearing, not hostile, and at the edge of the trees, far enough not to be seen, but close enough to be known. Someone stood again, watching, not hunting, not fleeing, just watching. The figure in the trees did not move for a long time. It remained still, almost part of the bark itself, watching with the kind of patience only the old world understood. The firelight reached it only in flickers, just enough to catch the glint of an eye, or the pale edge of a hand, and then, even those were gone. No sound followed, just the deep hush of night, the breath of the forest, the distant pulse of insects not yet ready to return. By morning, the watchers were tired but not startled. No one had approached. No stones had been thrown. No offerings had been left. The figure had come and gone like fog again present, then dispersed, leaving behind nothing but awareness. Still, something in the group had changed. The second fire was fed again before anyone said a word. A strip of bark was carved and placed at its base, not marked, just shaped smooth, as if to say, "We know you are here." The day began quietly. The rhythm returned, but slower, heavier. The children helped carry stones to the edge of the stream, building a low dam to trap fish more easily. It was play, but also function. One slipped and fell in, squealed, and came up laughing, water pouring from her nose. A man nearby smiled, then looked past her, past the water, toward the tree line again. No movement, but the dogs kept their ears turned that way. Later that morning, the hunters prepared. Not the full group, just two. One younger than the other, both experienced. They chose spears carefully tested. The tips against bark adjusted their hide slings and water skins. They didn't speak much, but they didn't move like they were afraid, just aware. One woman handed them a small pouch before they left. Inside crushed leaf and pine gum, burned when fear got inside the lungs. It didn't chase danger, but it gave clarity. They nodded thanks and disappeared into the trees, their shadows vanishing one behind the other. The group waited, not frozen, not anxious, just tuned. Every crack of twig, every flap of wing, every change in bird call was measured, weighed, stored. People worked, but no one forgot the forest had eyes. Near midday, the injured woman tried to stand again. This time she succeeded. Her leg shook, her face tightened, but she stood upright with the carved stick for balance. She took one step, then another. The group didn't cheer. They didn't even move toward her. They simply watched, because she had moved from healing to living again, and that shift mattered more than noise. A child offered her a strip of dried root. She chewed it without thanks, not out of rudeness, out of presence. Her body needed it. Her words were elsewhere. By late afternoon, the two hunters returned. They carried meat, not much, a small boar, not yet full grown, but it was enough. It had bled clean, the hide intact, no other wounds. They had done it quickly, cleanly, but their faces said more than the meat. They had seen something. They didn't tell the group right away. Instead, they skinned the animal, shared the liver with the elders, the heart with the children, and left the hooves near the edge of the fire as tribute. The rest was smoked. Then finally they spoke. "We saw a figure," the older hunter said. No reaction. Everyone had expected it. But he added, "Not one of ours. Not like us." That mattered. He didn't mean a stranger from another group. He meant different, smaller, thinner, paler. Moving upright, but not in a human way. The tracks were wrong, toes too long. He'd seen them by a stream bend. Fresh. Not deer, not bear, not anything that belonged here. No one interrupted. Then the younger hunter added, "It saw us." Then it ducked. Not ran, the elder clarified. Ducked. That word settled over the camp like ash. Not panic, but something close to reverence. Or dread. Because ducking meant recognition. It meant understanding. It meant they were not looking at an animal. They were looking at something that watched back. The elder woman with the pouch of tokens touched one, not to read it, just to feel it. The injured woman whispered something none of them heard. Later she would say it again, but not now. Before night fell, the fire circle was reshaped. A third fire, small, even further out. Not a challenge, a greeting, or a warning. No one was sure anymore. That night the moon was thin, a sliver sharp as bone. The dogs stayed close. The children slept curled like roots. And near the edge of the trees, someone or something exhaled once, long and slow. Not a word, just a breath shared across the oldest silence. The breath from the woods didn't echo, disappeared into the night the way a seed vanishes into soil unseen but not unfelt. The dogs didn't bark, they didn't lift their heads. They simply turned them all at once toward the same patch of darkness beyond the third fire. One of the women moved to stand. Her hand found the smooth handle of a club more from memory than intent. She didn't raise it. She only held it, letting the weight remind her she was still here. No one spoke. The coals of the third fire glowed faintly, casting a dull red circle around nothing. But the emptiness meant something. By dawn, the group was already awake. Not by choice, by instinct. No one had truly slept. They had closed their eyes, they had laid down, but their bodies had remained alert, still tracking sounds in dreams. The air was cooler again. The mist returned thin but stubborn, clinging to grass and bone. The second fire had gone out. The third had been disturbed, not destroyed, not scattered, but moved. A stone had shifted. A piece of bark had been laid across the top. Not human. Too smooth. Too careful. Someone had been there, or something. The boy who always watched footprints approached it. He crouched low, ran his fingers along the disturbed dirt. His lips pressed into a line. Then he stood. "Not us," he said. He didn't need to say more. The group gathered slowly, not in panic, not in fear, in pattern. People brought water tools, children, food drawn toward the middle again. Not for protection, for coherence. Like birds circling the same current, like bones aligning. By midday, the sun appeared sudden and hard. It burned away the mist. It cast everything into sharpness. The fire pits looked like eyes in the ground. The shelter seemed too exposed. The forest too close. So they moved, not far, just back deeper into the slope where boulders formed a partial wall and trees broke the sky. It wasn't a retreat. It was adjustment. They had done this before. Dogs ranged ahead, sniffing, lupin, never straying more than 30 paces. The move took only hours. The shelter was rebuilt with old hides and green branches. Firewood was carried. Coals were transferred in clay bowls kept alive by pine sap and breath. The third fire was left behind, on purpose. Let it remain there a sign. Let it burn out on its own. Let it whisper in the dark to whatever had watched them. That night, the new fire burned close to the rock face. It threw light in strange directions upward, sideways, flickering along cracks. Shadows danced across stone like animals too fast to catch. The elder woman took this fire as hers. She sat closest, her pouch of carved tokens beside her again. This time she opened it. She cast, one by one. Spiral, tooth. Crescent, 3 dots, a broken line. Then she swept them aside, cast again. The same spiral, the same 3 dots, the same broken line. She said nothing, but those closest to her noticed her hand trembled just once, then stilled. The injured woman slept more deeply that night. Her wound was healing clean. No fever, no infection. But her dreams were troubled. She twitched, murmured, turned her head from side to side. The girl beside her, the one who had held her hand during a fever, whispered nonsense sounds until she stilled again. The two hunters sharpened their spears again, not because they were going out, because they didn't like feeling still. One of them, the younger, placed his finished spear upright in the ground, leaned his forehead against it, and breathed slowly. His body had grown leaner over the past days, not thinner, more defined, like the edges of him were sharpening. The other men and women tended tools, hides, baskets, but their eyes kept drifting to the trees. The birds hadn't returned. No calls, no rustling in the canopy, no movement, just the wind and the creak of branches. Then late in the night movement, not in the trees, on the rock. The firelight caught something faint, white, deliberate, a mark, just above eye level where the stone was smoothest. A line, then another, then 3 slashes downward, fresh, still damp at the edges. No one had seen it appear. It hadn't been there when they arrived. It wasn't part of the rock's old pattern. The man who slept closest to it stood first. He walked to it, touched it. It didn't smudge. It was made with something thicker than water. He turned, looked at the others, shook his head once. Then he sat again. The mark remained, not threatening, not welcoming, just there. And everyone knew what it meant, even if they could not name it. They were not alone, not in the camp, not in the forest, not in the story. Something had entered the rhythm of their days, not to destroy, not to join, but to be seen. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. No one touched the mark on the rock again. It stayed through the night, through the cold, even after mist returned with morning. The fire burned low, casting an orange shimmer across the slashes, pale strokes cut with purpose, made by a hand, not a claw. But the meaning was still out of reach. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a symbol they knew. It was just left, like a foot pressed into soft earth, like a voice carried in breath. It had no shape but presence, and presence was enough. That morning no one spoke of moving again. The camp had already shifted once. To move again would not be survival, it would be fear. And fear, when named too clearly, could spread like sickness. So they stayed, but their movements changed. They made fewer jokes, they made fewer sounds. They moved in pairs even when gathering small things, bark moss reeds for weaving. Tasks done every day now felt rehearsed, as though the performance mattered more than the result. Children were taught without speaking. The oldest girl demonstrated how to split fibers into thread. The youngest watched, copied, failed, tried again. The lesson passed from hand to hand, not mouth to ear, and the rhythm of it, the twistle twist, became a kind of lullaby, not for sleeping but for staying sane. The elder with the carved tokens didn't cast that day. She turned each one over in her hands again and again, as if trying to wear the meaning into her skin. When the spiral came up 3 times in a row, she tucked them away and sat in silence. One man went to the rock wall and sat beneath the slashes. He didn't touch them. He just sat, carving a bit of bone into a hook. It would take him hours. He didn't rush. The act of carving, slow, precise, was a kind of defiance. He would do human things even when watched, especially when watched. By mid-afternoon the air thickened, not with weather, with waiting. The birds still hadn't returned. The wind barely moved. The trees whispered, but only in ways that meant not yet. The woman with the healing leg walked again. 3 steps, then 5, then 10. Her balance had returned. The stick helped, but she didn't lean on it. She used it the way a torch is used to push back against dark places. When she stopped walking, she looked to the tree line, then beyond it, not in fear, in memory. Later, when the sun reached its highest point, someone returned. Not the ones who had watched from the woods, not the not quite human shapes, but someone else. A man, alone, wearing hide that didn't belong to this group. His face was familiar to one of the elders, not by name but by story. He had lived with another camp 2 seasons ago, south near the river fork. That camp had not been seen since winter. He stood at the edge of the clearing waiting, not afraid, not proud, just waiting. Hunters saw him first. They didn't lift their weapons. They didn't call out. They simply watched. The man held up both hands, empty. He stepped forward slowly. The dogs bristled but didn't bark. The women paused their weaving. The children moved behind their mothers. The elder stood. Her voice was the first of the day. "Why are you alone?" The man's answer was simple. They stopped speaking. He didn't mean death. He meant silence. He described it in broken words, how slowly, one by one, his group had stopped making sound. First in the mornings, then around the fire, then even in sleep. They moved. They ate. They worked. But they made no sound. He had woken one morning to find them all sitting staring at the trees. And he left. Not out of fear, out of instinct. He didn't want to forget how to speak. The elder asked him what direction he had come from. He pointed not toward the mark on the rock, but near it, not at the watchers, but around them. She nodded. He was allowed in, not trusted, but allowed. That night, he sat at the outer circle of the fire. He did not eat with the others. He did not speak again, but he hummed low, steady, wordless, a sound that reminded the others of rain hitting stretched hide. Children listened with wide eyes. One of them began to mimic the tone, then another. Soon the fire crackled beneath a layer of soft sound. Not music, not a chant, just vibration, life moving back through the throat. At the edge of the trees, No one appeared. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave, and above the fire, the slashes on the stone seemed brighter than before, sharper, like something had been added. At dawn, the mark on the rock had changed again, not erased, added to, a fourth line faint and fresh carved beside the three that had come before, not drawn by human tools, not flint, not bone. It was wider, duller, as if pressed by nail or tooth or something not shaped like hands at all. No one saw it happen. No one heard a sound. But it was there. The man who had come from the southern fork saw it first. He stared at it for a long time, unmoving. Then wordlessly, he sat again, this time closer to the fire, closer to the group. His hum had stopped. His eyes no longer drifted toward the trees. He looked at people now, measured them, and stayed quiet. The slashes were counted. 4 now. 4 could mean many things. A warning, a counting, a sentence. Some wanted to mark over them. Others wanted to leave them be. The elder said nothing. She only drew a circle in the dirt beside the fire and placed 4 stones in it, then covered them with ash. The group understood. Don't disturb the language even if you don't speak it. That day, they gathered more than usual. More bark, more wood, more roots. Some part of them had begun to prepare for what none could name. But the old rhythms, the safe ones, began to bend. Nets were mended. Spears were triple-checked. Children were taught how to listen to ground vibrations, not just what the ear heard, but what the bones could feel. The injured woman, no longer truly injured, helped skin a bird caught in one of the higher traps. Her hands were steady now. Her eyes focused. Her stick rested beside her unused. She moved with quiet decision, as if each gesture was a thread in a greater pattern only she could see. She asked no questions, but when a child asked her what the marks meant, she answered, "They're not for us." And that somehow settled the air, because not everything needed to be about you to still be dangerous. That evening, one of the hunters found something in the trees. A scrap of hide stretched between 2 low branches, tied with twisted grass, decorated with crushed charcoal and sap. It was a face, not real shape, a curve for eyes, a dark smudge for a mouth, too small to wear, too fragile to survive wind. It had been left, placed where it would be seen, a message, a mirror, or a game. He didn't bring it back to camp. He buried it under stone. When asked why, he said only, "Because it remembered me." The elder said nothing, but the fire that night burned hotter than usual. The woman with the pouch of tokens didn't cast. Instead she sang, low and slow, not a song of joy, not mourning. It was a song of place, of naming each tree, each shape, each ancestor, a map of belonging spoken aloud. Others joined. The man from the fork did not. He sat beside them, now legs folded, but his hands were pressed tight to his knees. When the singing stopped, he whispered, "They will come again tonight." No one asked how he knew, because they knew too. The dogs felt it first. Their ears stiffened, their paws pressed flat to the dirt. Their eyes didn't blink. The moon rose half full, high and cold. The slashes on the stone looked almost silver, and then footsteps, not soft, not loud, just there, not many, not charging, a few, measured, then breath not near, not far, not human. The air changed. People didn't grab weapons, they didn't shout, they just became still, like prey, or like stone. The woman who had healed stood up. She held no spear, no club, no tool. She walked to the edge of the firelight, not beyond it. She faced the trees. She didn't speak, and something in the dark exhaled. Not a threat, not a greeting, not even recognition. Just sound old, slow, thoughtful. Then nothing, not departure, not approach, just absence again. She returned to the fire, sat down. Someone asked her, what did it want? She shook her head. It doesn't want, it remembers. The child who had asked stopped chewing bark and stared at the trees. The rest of the group slept close together that night. No one posted a guard, not from trust, from exhaustion, and from knowing now that if something came, they would feel it before they saw it, and when they did, they would not run. The sun rose late, not by time but by presence. It crept slowly across the treetops, lighting the stones and hides and sleeping bags of those curled near the fire. No bird sang, no wind stirred. The world was not dead, only watching itself. The 4 marks on the stone had not changed, but beside them, drawn with wet ash and finger, a new mark had appeared. A spiral, not the elder's token, not a dream, drawn while they slept. The group saw it at first light. No one touched it. The elder woman nodded once. She said only we're inside the story now, and that was enough. The man from the southern fork had not slept. He had sat all night near the fire legs, folded hands, steady eyes unblinking. When the sun reached his face, he closed them. Then he opened them again and stood. "I go," he said. No one tried to stop him. He took no spear, no pack, only the memory of the path behind him and the hum in his throat and the shape of those who had stopped speaking long ago. He walked into the trees. He did not vanish, but he did not return. That morning, the group worked in silence. They mended, cleaned, scraped, gathered, not because it was safe or because the visitors had gone, but because the body must move or it forgets it's alive. The woman who had once been wounded climbed the slope above the shelter. Her leg was strong again. She stood on the ridge and looked beyond the trees. She saw nothing, but she stayed there a long time, thinking, not of fear, not of spirits, but of pattern, of sound returning, of watching something that had watched her first. Below, the children played again, not loud but free. One carved a shape into a flat stone with a stick, a hand with 5 long fingers and a circle at the palm. No one told him to stop. One of the hunters placed a new boundary marker at the northern edge, a ring of bone shards with a red thread woven through. It was not meant to keep anything out, just to say, we are here too. The air lightened. The forest did not, but something in the group had shifted. They had not fought. They had not fled. They had endured, and in doing so, they had become part of the place in a way they hadn't before. Not guests, not masters, but remembered. That evening, they lit only one fire. At the center, no second, no third. The spiral on the rock still shone faintly in the fading light. The elder didn't cast. She didn't sing. She sat with her eyes closed, the pouch unopened beside her. The boy who once drew spirals in dirt now lay beside her asleep. The dogs rested without twitching. The wind returned, soft, smelling of pine and stone and the old roots below. Before sleep, someone asked the woman with the strong leg, "What happens now?" She looked at the fire, then the trees, then the stone, and she answered, "Now we remember too." Nothing more was said, nothing more was needed. That night the stars were bright, no footsteps came, no watcher stood, only the memory of being seen, and the quiet steady breath of people who had not changed the world, but who had learned in silence to belong to it.